Myself, like I said, introduction already, Josh Wiki. I'll explain a little more of my background in a second. I'll start today talking about myself, which is something I don't generally like to do, but it helps me frame the dialogue and conversation for what's going to take place here. The most important part for probably the vast majority of the people who are attending today is going to be my talk in general around what do careers look like in cybersecurity in general. And then I'll also kind of wrap up with a little discussion about how we have early professional experiences or some of the opportunities we offer at Microsoft for students or for recent graduates. I'll wrap up at the end with questions, but I'll also probably stick around a little after the fact if people have some additional things they want to ask me or any questions. So like I said, I'm going to start to begin with talking about myself, which is not something I generally like doing, but I will do nonetheless. I am from a small rural town. I grew up on a horse farm out in a township called Beckwith. If anyone's not familiar with where Beckwith is, and I doubt anyone is, if anyone knows Carleton Place, kind of like 30 kilometers west of the city, past Stittsville, that's where I'm from originally. I spent my summers growing up with my grandparents in a small town on the St. Lawrence River called Cardinal that roughly falls between Cornwall and Brockville or Kingston. I am a third generation Carleton University graduate. So my mother was a graduate from here. Her father was also a graduate from here. So I'm a bit of a proud Raven. I moved to the city in Ottawa in 2013 to do my undergraduate degree. I've also got a master's degree from down in the States, so I've got a little bit into that. And then I like the fun features that you'll remember about me if you've heard anything else. I previously owned a pet chinchilla named Theo. That's just a generic chinchilla photo pulled from the internet in case you've never seen one before. That's not my actual one that I have. And I'm terrible at cooking. Out of curiosity today, I like to get a feel for the room. Who here's a computer science grad? Oh, like a computer science student? Show of hands. Yeah, vast majority. Okay. Who here is an engineering student of some sort outside of that domain? All right. Is there anyone other than yourself who is not a computer science or an engineering student? Anything like social sciences? Perfect. Anything like, okay, I'm curious. I just want to get a feel. What are you?
Oh, well, I'm a cyber.
Okay, you're cyber specifically? Okay, that large encompassing. So good cyber.
Psych.
Psych, perfect.
Political science, but I transferred out of engineering.
Okay, well, you and I we're gonna have a great pairing here. And then there was one other I believe kicking around, two others.
Mathematics.
Mathematics. Okay, I'm gonna call that computer science. So,
Okay.
So
Network technology.
network, you're a bit student.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I know a few bit students. Perfect. All right. So I will, obviously, I'm going to be pandering to the tech crowd here today, but you'll understand why I want to make sure that everyone else is included as well. So how did I get here? So ironically, when I did my bachelor's at Carleton, I did not do a bachelor's in computer science or engineering. I'm actually a political science graduate for my undergraduate. So back when I was in high school, I started out kind of as a lifeguard swim instructor, and I'll get into why that's important later, but it provided me some money to be able to go to university for starters. It provided me a chance to learn how to teach people, how to teach them things, whether they're young students, whether they're adults who are fearful of the water or have never interacted with the water before. That's kind of how I worked out, and I started, and I'm going to try and every step along my employment journey have a bit of a discussion about where those skills still apply today to the job that I do. So I started out as a teacher, is the way that I like to explain things, with a little bit of responsibility if you're operating in a pool. The long story short is the pools that I operated out of, it was mostly folks between 19 and 23. They threw us the keys at the beginning of the summer. And I said, good luck, make sure everyone's all right over the course of the summer. And we'll come back in the fall and then we'll call it a day. So from an early age, kind of was required to be responsible and conscientious of what I did, how I functioned as a professional, and what that impact was on the community or other people. At that time, while I was in high school, like I said, I did a lot of my training or any sort of professional development around certifications required to become a lifeguard. So Bronze Medallion, Bronze Cross, National Life Saving Service, and my teaching credentials. So that was a requirement that I had to do from a professional development perspective. Throughout my entire career, whether I was going to school or whether I was working, I was simultaneously more or less required to work and improve my skills at the same time. And this is going to be a common theme I have throughout the presentation, which is try to constantly be learning or try to constantly be improving yourself as you go through life. So I get to Carleton, political science. I want a big boy job. I don't feel like lifeguarding. I don't feel like teaching swimming lessons is my vocation, my calling in life that I want to do for the rest of my life. So I want something that's a little more grounded. And so I opt to, through a friend that I'd known from Carleton at the time who made me aware of the program, is the Federal Student Work Experience Program. Anyone familiar with the concept of FSWEP? See a couple of hands around here. So for anyone who doesn't know what FSWEP is, it's basically a lottery system where you can apply as a student, you can put in a request, the federal government hires a certain amount, and they basically pop you into a job, and you get paid fairly well, better than I did as a lifeguard, to be able to do a sort of professional level job at an entry level. Now, the way that FSWEP worked at the time, and I'm not sure if this is the way it still works because it's been about 10 years at this point. But the way FSWEP worked at the time was it was basically a checkbox exercise of where you're good at, not directly associated with what your program is. I don't know if anyone's got experience with this now. If that's still you're nodding your head like that's the way it still works. I always loved computers. From a young age, I was very involved with computers. My dad was an electrical engineer from the hardware side. Now, back in the 90s, hardware was a lot more common than it is nowadays. I'd say he said roughly one hardware engineer for every 3 software engineers back then. I would argue maybe one hardware engineer for every 100, 1,000 software engineers at this point. A lot of that's been abstracted away. And so my father got burned pretty bad in the dot-com era. No one's familiar with that. Basically, early 2000s, tech market kind of was a bubble. It was a little frothy, collapsed. A lot of people lost their jobs at the time. And so my father actually never went back to working in tech. He completely retrained to become a municipal planner and basically told me, stay away from tech. Don't go anywhere near tech. You don't want to do that. So even though I had a passion for it, I went off for political science. My original intention at this point then was to be a spy or a foreign trade officer. So I wanted to work for either CSIS or the Communications Security Establishment or the military, or I wanted to be a trade officer at what at the time was the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, but has since become Global Affairs Canada. And so that was my original intention when I came to school. And for most of the time that I was working part-time for the federal government as an FSWEP student for 7 terms. Terms typically take place over 4 months at a time. So that basically comes to an end. And I'm left with an option. My colleagues at the time in the federal government, while I was working for an IT security team, basically said, we're happy with the quality of the work that you're doing. We're very, comfortable. We'd love to have you on the team full time. How about you come and join us as a full-time employee? And I said, no, probably not. Not really something I'm interested in. I want to be a spy or I want to be a diplomat, right? And my manager at the time, Jason McAndrew, basically said, well, do your research, figure it out, see how it's going to go. If no one's familiar with the way language classifications work within the federal government of Canada, you basically have bilingualism, so English and French, je parle français aussi. Now, I took French immersion growing up through school. However, my French wasn't good enough to be able to get into, say, be a trade officer in the federal government. I would have had to have gone back and do a little more of that. Plus, when I did the digging into it, an undergraduate wasn't going to cut it. I also had to have my master's degree. So I said, you know what, I could go back, I could do my master's degree, that wouldn't be a problem. Now, all the public jobs in the federal government, they post what your pay ratios are based off of whenever you get in. And then I figured out that, I would have had to have gone back, done a master's, improved my French, and I would have got paid $10,000 less per year at that point than starting that IT role at that period of time. So, clapped my hands and said, I guess I'm an IT guy now. I continued working for the federal government for several years as an IT security analyst, working both in IT security operations, and I'll get into the differences of the different security roles in a bit, but I also ended up joining the military reserve. So I was a member of the 33 Signal Regiment, which is in Ottawa, just off of Walkley Road, as a signals intelligence analyst. Technically, at the time, we were called comms research, communications research. But I did that off the side. And then during my evenings, I was using massively online content like Coursera to be able to improve some of my technical skills or capabilities and to start playing around with this thing called the public cloud. Public cloud, most people would know, is like these days Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure. At the time, I was primarily working in Google Cloud Platform, which just totally makes sense for where I ended up. effectively what ended up happening while I was doing that full-time work was the federal government wanted to get into implementing public cloud as a way of lessening the amount of hardware they had to buy and expanding some of their capabilities in the tech company. And because I came from a security background, there was a lot of concerns at the time. I got moved over into the cloud team as a security member to shut down a lot of those resources because there were security concerns. Within a short period of time of working within there, I actually discovered this is actually pretty good technology. This is probably actually more secure than a lot of the stuff that we were already doing. And so based off of that information, I basically became an advocate for cloud. I worked with several departments at the time, and eventually that caught the eye of some folks working with Microsoft locally. I had a meeting with my current manager, who ended up hiring me, and so I became a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. Very open, generic term, effectively just implementing different sorts of cloud solutions within the Microsoft suite of products. I'll get more into the details about that in a second. Did that for several years, and then I got a really cool offer to be the senior advisor to the Canadian military's public cloud program. So a whole kit and caboodle, whole thing, helping out the military adopt the public cloud. So I took a one-year contract. I was a consultant for there during that time period. And while I was doing that, I actually went back to school and I did my master's degree in cybersecurity. I was referred there from some colleagues from the communication security establishment. And so I finished up my master's of science in cybersecurity with a concentration in digital forensics. And then after having done that 1 year, I went back to Microsoft as a senior cloud solution architect. And since then, I've continued doing various different training regimes, but the big one I'm on these days is a little thing called Hack the Box Academy, with a wide variety of security offerings ranging from things like red teaming, which I'll get into in a second, around pen testing, penetration testing, offensive security, things like security operations center work, which we call blue teaming, so more of the defensive side of things. I'll touch on that. Any questions about this timeline? Now, starting out, I'll say around University Carleton 2013, moving forward to present time is kind of what that looks like. So I would say over the last 10-ish years. Any questions?
What certificates do you have?
I'm a CISP, so Certified Information System Security Professional. I am a CCSP, so Certified Cloud Security Professional. I have 3 expert level certifications from the Microsoft side, so Azure DevOps, so DevOps Engineering, my Azure Infrastructure specialty for Azure. I have my security architect expert level certifications from Microsoft. I was a Google Cloud professional architect, one of the first 5,000 in the world. And then I got some other various ones around MITRE and security certs you probably.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. They give us free attempts and trials at all the certifications on the Microsoft side, so I can just keep slinging those things on the side.
When it comes to like online courses and certifications, how did you go about choosing which ones were like actually worth investing time?
So great question. I started with kind of organizations that I was trusting that I would put those into. And so for me on Coursera, there was a lot of content that was offered from Google specifically. Kind of a household name, a little small startup from the West Coast of the United States. And so I went with them and I found they had a wonderful blend of theoretical concepts delivered through videos and then practical hands-on labs. So I could actually work with the technology and understand how it works and be able to demonstrate that I understood how it worked. And so there was a bit of a positive feedback loop because believe me, I've done other courses where you just know immediately they're not evolving, right? Where you don't feel you're learning anything, or you don't feel that that's actually something that you're going to actively work with within an environment. And oftentimes I drop those. I was very impressed with the Coursera content that I did. It was not cheap, but I wouldn't call it extremely expensive either. I think at the time I was paying $60 a month for unlimited access. But I ended up doing over 400 labs as part of that training. Yeah, no problem. And I will say, like I said, I went back to university, so I'll always praise, universities are great places to learn. But it's hard for them to keep pace with the rate of change that exists within the technology world. And so it's nice to be able to combine some of those things back and forth from a practical sense. So what exactly do I do? I ripped these right out of my job description, so they're going to sound a little corporate, but I'll try and put that jargon into what it actually means. So leading architectural design sessions, specific implementation projects, that just basically means I'm building a solution based off the customer's requirements, right? Do we need to be able to gather log telemetry from an endpoint device, to be able to aggregate that into a system to see what's taking place on that system, right? Are people, forking binaries? Are people trying to extract, credentials or any sort of passwords or identities that exist on that system that are in use? Those sorts of things. Assessing the security readiness of customers. I already said this earlier, right? I've gone into customers before and they tell me they're still running Server 2008, Windows XP, but these are things that need to be upgraded. You have to understand the context, how many devices exist, what's the level of risk associated with those, and how can you provide tailored advice or guidance to them about what they need to address first. And this is large government organizations, banks, insurance companies, telecommunications providers. No organization is immune to these sorts of things. In-depth technical discussions, right? So sometimes I get to have very nice, high in the sky, easy breezy discussions. Sometimes, like today, actually earlier today, I have to get down into the nuance of how does the specific software module work within the Linux kernel, right? Relationships are a big thing too. Ultimately, business is driven by people and what they want to get done and who specifically can get those things done. So while I did not end up getting a diplomatic position with Affairs Canada, sometimes I still get to play a diplomat between different sorts of egos and priorities that exist within organizations. And then technical support from both a pre-sales perspective and a post-sales perspective. That just means sometimes the customer has something from Microsoft that they need support with. Sometimes they have a need to get something from Microsoft, and I help out with both. There are different teams that specialize in those specific things, and I'll touch on that in a second about when I talk about the different careers that exist in cybersecurity. But I'm a fairly flexible technical resource, as are the other 20 colleagues of mine that exist across Canada. That's all we've got, 20 people that typically do the field sort of cybersecurity work from the Microsoft perspective within Canada. That's what we do. So I suppose if I was to summarize a couple things that I like to highlight from my journey that I often talk to people about, is I have an unconventional path for my career in cybersecurity, and that's not unique to me. Mostly today I'll be talking anecdotally about my personal experiences, but this is not unique. If you talk to other members on my team, you'll hear similar stories. And so if I was to prioritize a couple things in general from this, I would say it never matters where you start at. A journey can take you anywhere. This is something my manager says, and I literally copied and pasted right out of one of his pieces, is doesn't matter whether you're a software engineer or you're a computer science student or you're a political science student or you're a psychology student, there are many ways to a cybersecurity job where they will be practical or they will fit in. Something I take personally and was what helped me do all of that extra work or get up to speed or work within the cybersecurity industry coming from something that was adjacent was you want to do something you take a genuine interest in, right? I never saw myself working in the cybersecurity world, but once I started working around it, I saw a lot of the parallels to the things that had motivated me towards wanting to be a spy or wanting to be a diplomat, right? Things like having to solve problems with limited resources, things like having to interact with difficult people, things like being able to help solve problems that genuinely help bring up the quality of people's jobs. Right? One thing I will say, and I was discussing this a little before we started the conversation, is I find society does a disservice to our youth when we make them make decisions as like 14 or 15 years old, if they're grade 11 or 12 courses that are going to adjust the trajectory of the rest of their lives, right? With no context or background about how the world works. So we take input from other people, right? And oftentimes, very good input made with the best of intentions, right? So like my father's saying, stay out of tech. I got burned by tech. I don't want you to get burned by tech, right? That's probably the difference between me taking a comp sci program and ending up in a similar place versus me taking a poli sci program and somehow still ending up here, right? And so I often say is, you don't know what you're going to be interested in until you're actually presented with it. And so I think that's probably one of my largest things that I advocate for is go out, try things, whether you think you're going to like them or not, you won't know until you actually have done it. And you might be surprised by the things that you actually end up doing and what you take an interest in. And that can change the trajectory of your life. Now, this is the meaty part of the presentation that's actually probably going to be the most relevant to the folks that are here. So as I was highlighting before, cybersecurity exists in all domains. I've ripped this content from a source that I have in the bottom left corner there. Cybersecurity covers a lot of domains, right? We got things like risk assessment, right? How are we meeting international compliance requirements to cover the bare necessities that need to take place? These are things that are developed by governments like NIST or Canada for our communication security establishment. There are things that are developed by standards organizations like ISO. There are things that protect you every day that you probably don't really know that much about. So I'll use an example of PCI DSS, Payment Cards Industry Data Security Standards, right? What does somebody who has to interact with a credit card have to do from a bare necessities perspective to make sure that their systems are covering security concerns to ensure that when we use our credit cards, that they're not going to be compromised? Or if they are compromised, how do they have to share that information with the development partners? There are things like lawmakers, right? We don't typically think of lawyers when we think of cybersecurity. We think of people writing code or interacting in a terminal session. There are members of parliament, but most of the time, more often than not, going to be a lot of technical folks, right? People writing the software, they're doing a good job. Are they leaving bound issues? There are people who are supporting those motions, right? For every one person that's probably writing the software, you're probably going to have somebody who implements that solution. You're going to have somebody who sells that solution. You're going to have somebody who's managing those people. So there's lots of jobs that are adjacent within the security domain that aren't just writing code themselves. And if you want to write code, that's completely fine. That's perfect. But what does some of these roles actually look like? Now, out of curiosity, who here has ever worked in a domain that they would consider adjacent or within cybersecurity? Who thinks they've ever done work within school that's practically applicable to cybersecurity? I would guess, hopefully, at the end of this, that I can motivate you to think that you've all done some of that at some point. Application development, right? There are always going to be people who are, anyone who's designing or implementing the system has some security responsibility to make sure that it's written in an appropriate manner that can't be abused. But we do have specialists in those areas, right? People who are going to use things like dynamic application security testing to be able to look at static code to determine if it is properly linted, if it has package dependencies, right? Has anyone here worked with Node before? Anybody here tried to pull a trim left function that has 1,500 dependencies? There's security concerns associated with that. If you see that a trim left function is pulling 1,500 dependencies, ask some questions, right? There are people who have to audit that. Anyone here ever gone through a code check before, or any sort of peer programming where you had to have someone analyze your code before it was submitted, right? That's an example of a sort of security test that's taking place. Architecturally, this is going to be more related to folks from an infrastructure perspective, not necessarily the people who are writing the code themselves, but how do the systems start to fit together, right? What operating systems are we using? What platforms are we using? How are we interconnecting those things with things like networking? What restrictions are we putting in place to be able to segment those from, say, a private network versus a public network, right? The network that's used in your home environment is going to be very different than the network that's used internally for a bank or a government organization, right? Auditing. This is the boring stuff, the maybe boring stuff, right? This is, I would say, less on the technical end of things and more on the checkbox exercises, but still important, an important thing to do, right? Are people actually doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, right? Have they thought about things like log management to ensure if somebody gets malicious access to a system, that we have a record of what they were accessing and when they were accessing it, right? Cloud, popular subject. Anybody worked in the cloud or anybody around here? I see one hand. Anybody ever spun up something on Amazon Web Services? That's the cloud. Anybody ever stored a document in Google Drive? That's the cloud. All right, so, right? It takes people to understand how those things relate, right? There's a big difference between running a project locally on your device versus something that's being managed by Microsoft or Amazon or Google. And you have to understand the way that we talk about a shared responsibility model, right? What is Microsoft handling? What do you as a customer leveraging Microsoft services have to handle to make sure that that system is secure? Compliance, this goes back to what I was saying previously around things like rules and regulations from a legal perspective, right? Are we making sure that credit cards are being handled? Investigation, this is the cool stuff I like to do, right? Digital forensics, right? Who was doing a certain thing at a specific period of time? How can we use log evidence to be able to determine, right? How can we use things like network traffic analysis? Everyone's probably heard of IP addresses, MAC addresses, you hear some sort of crime investigation show, where were they coming from? How are they coming from? How do you prove that, right? We call that non-repudiation in the industry, right? How can you prove beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody was doing something that they say? There's literally a defense in the security world that we talk about. It was that other guy, right? Well, no, somebody else had access to my computer. You can't tell, you can't say it, right? That holds up in court, right? Unless you can actually prove that it was that person doing that thing at that time. More interesting for people working in the software development world, this is also where we get into things like malware analysts, right? I've got to do this before. You get viruses, you get content, you get malware, whether it was developed by a script kiddie or a criminal organization or a foreign state, right? And you have to pull it apart and figure out, you have to reverse engineer, what is it actually doing? This comes in all shapes and sizes. Compiled languages, fairly easy to work back on, but if you have to go through something where you're getting just a binary and you have to render it down into assembly language, and then you have to work back from that assembly language with techniques like obfuscation to try and make it difficult to understand what's taking place, to actually figure out what's happening, that's a pretty specialized skill. Networking, I already mentioned. If you haven't worked with networking before, it's the pipes that serve the internet. The internet's basically just oil trying to move through pipes. Offensive security. Red teaming. Anyone heard of penetration testing before, or hacking? Hacking is probably more common than that. Bad people are going to do that, right? You're always going to have criminal organizations or foreign state actors that are incentivized to be able to try and break into networks. The good guys can do that too. The good people can do that too. Right? So red teams oftentimes is what we'll refer to as offensive security, and that comes from a military terminology that's rather old. But red teams and network security, those kind of offensive security specialists, their job is to proactively try and break into a network, right? So within Microsoft, we have red teamers, we have offensive security specialists. Other organizations, banks, they might hire a contractor to do that. And they go in and they use various publicly available tools. They'll write their own tools. They'll understand how the environment works, depending on how much has been told them beforehand, or how much they can figure out with the telemetry that they have available to them. And they will try and get as far as they can to show how that can be done, so that we can put mitigating measures in place to make sure people who want to do harm can't do that. Operations, this is the opposite of the offensive security. This is more the defensive security, typically what we call blue teaming, right? These are the people who have to defend on a daily basis. They have to look at firewall logs. They have to look at endpoint device logs. They have to figure out what's taking place within the environment, what looks like known good and what looks like known bad. Very different skill sets across all of this. And what I'm trying to highlight, and I am going to go through all of them, but what I'm trying to highlight here, most important of all, is there are lots of different skill sets or different backgrounds that operate within a cybersecurity world. And so if you like writing code, there is a security application for you. If you don't like writing code, but you still like being adjacent to technology, there's a job for you as well, right? If you don't do anything from the technical domain, but if you operate or you're interested in things like law or writing policy or governance, there are still practical applications of where you can work within the cybersecurity world. Education, that's one of the places that I started out, right? Don't click on that phishing link. Who here has probably received a phishing link in the last 30 days? A lot of hands going up. That's one of the primary ways that either individuals or organizations are going to be compromised is individual weakness, right? Or user awareness that needs to take place. And there's people that have to go out from that. And there's a significant psychological function that has to exist there, right? There are people from the offensive security side, especially psychologists, who work intentionally to try and exploit or prey on human weakness, right? Things like empathy. These are still obviously good things, but they're going to try and find ways to exploit those things to make you do things that are in their better intentions that are bad for you at the end of the day. And that's why we have roles like people in education, like security awareness trainers, who have to go out and explain, hey, I know I know you would love to be able to look at that USB that was dropped in the parking lot that says exam test questions, but I'm telling you, it's probably not a good idea. There's probably something more to take place there. More on the math sides of things, especially if we're getting into the deep engineering from a security perspective. Who here has ever had to do a course or a module on cryptography? Not as many hands as I would have expected. Foundations of what we consider integrity or trust within the entire cybersecurity world is rooted in deep math, right? Cryptographic functions that exist and are currently being pushed to the breaking point with things like quantum cryptography or computational methods, but deep level requirements from an engineering perspective to manipulate things like math to be able to provide or build a basis for trust that all of the other platforms, whether it's websites, whether it's payment systems, or whether it's just the ability of you to log into your device, that all have to be built on. There's a lot of things to cover, and so sometimes you just need a generalist, somebody who knows a little bit about all of these sorts of things. And that's kind of where I fit in more often than not. Let's skip over governance because I consider that to be much akin to something that I've already covered from a topic perspective, which is the legal or the regulatory perspective around how do laws get created or how do we interpret those things. Privacy. This is one that not always falls to people from the computer science domain. You'll deal with a lot of people from library management backgrounds who work with this, but sometimes more from a legal domain as well. Is what are the stipulations or requirements you have to defend the privacy of the people that exist within the organization, right? What are the methods that we use to be able to do that? Are we using things like a labeling system to say that this information is more important than this other information, right? What are the controls that we put in place on this, right? Am I allowed to just send out an email with 50 credit card numbers associated? Sales. Some people like to work in sales. That's their area. I personally sometimes have to support the sales folks. More than happy to do that. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't own a cybersecurity product or they don't have coverage associated with that, it's not going anywhere. So they have their role to play as well, as some people like to work in that field. It's oftentimes one of the more lucrative professions that exists within the cybersecurity world is the selling of cybersecurity. Threat intelligence. This is what originally drew me to cybersecurity, having been interested in an intelligence background and having done some of the work around there, right? What are the typical trends we see from a security perspective that exists across the world, right? Are we seeing specific forms of attack? Who are using those specific forms of attack? What are they trying to get out of those things? How do we share that information back and forth between similar or different organizations? Oftentimes, right now, this is going to primarily fall within the domain of governments who are able to generate this information, or large-scale companies like Microsoft who get to deal with trillions of telemetry points every day, right? And so we're able to take in a giant pipeline of things, whether it's happening on Xbox, Outlook, or Windows, or business or consumer side, and we're able to take that all in and say, this is good, this is bad, this is the patterns of bad, these are the people we think are doing this, and this is why we think they're doing them, and this is how you can protect yourself from that sort of thing. And then the topic du jour, AI, right? Show of hands, who here has heard of the concept of jailbreaking an AI? Oh, that's a lot of hands. Who here has tried to jailbreak an AI before to get it to do something it's not supposed to do? There's a lot of hands. All right, so see, I didn't see that many hands when people were talking about doing security-oriented work or any sort of skilling. So anytime we're working with any sort of technology, and this kind of falls back in line with some of the offensive perspective or the software development side of things, is how far can we push it, right? What can we do to try and get it to do something it's not intended to do or something that's harmful, right? Because we can use that information to better build the systems to make sure that these kind of different systems aren't causing harm to people or society as a whole. And so if I was to summarize the entire slide, and there is some color coding that exists here between stage of career associated with it, you're going to notice that the vast majority of these roles are more later career, more advanced concepts or more complicated circumstances to find yourselves in. And I'll get into that in a second. But before I do that, I know it's a huge section, so I just want to ask, who now feels like they've done something in some way related to cybersecurity? More hands this time than others, maybe? Still a lot of doubt in the room. I feel like you're not trusting yourselves as much. Any questions on this slide about some of the different roles that exist within the cybersecurity role?
Well, would be a lot of the role, or well, all of the roles have some kind of stage associated with them. What would that look like?
So typically we're talking about mid to later career, and I'm gonna get into that in a second with the next slide, about where do you start a career moving into cyber. Because more often than not, and this is going to be, I know we already, some people had asked me about this earlier. More often than not, if you're going to end up working in a cybersecurity career, it's more than not likely that you're going to start somewhere else and eventually come to cybersecurity. There are very few programs. We're starting to see development. Carleton this year is just offering for the first time a dedicated cybersecurity program. But for the vast majority of individuals, you will start somewhere else where you will become acclimatized or an industry expert in a specific function, and then you will learn the security implications of that function rather than starting just as a security generalist. And the reason that that's going to happen is because security is a very, very, very broad topic, as you're starting to see, right? And the skills that it takes to be able to understand network analysis of packet captures, of how an actual datagram traverses the line between the internet, between, say, a client and a host, and the ability to understand how out of bounds memory exceptions exist within software code, and how a vulnerability needs to be patched on an operating system, and how to manage those operating systems at scale across thousands of devices is not something people leave university knowing. It's things that people will start off specializing and gradually working their way up from an entry-level position to understand a specific domain, and that they'll become more acclimatized or expand to over a period. So where does a career in cybersecurity start? We call them feeder roles, right? More or less. You're going to start doing probably something else in IT before you're going to be working in cybersecurity. You're going to be doing something like an educational background, right? You're going to be doing something like software development, understand or implement the system and learn what works, what doesn't work, and how that system can be manipulated, and what good coding practices look like and what bad coding practices look like. Because as you become more comfortable with those things, right? I had a question earlier about the implementation of a Rust programming language over C++, right? You're going to start to learn about what are the benefits that a system like Rust has over C++, and what are the defensive mechanisms that you have to put in place when you're coding to be able to avoid some of those issues. Some of this stuff becomes abstracted as new technology becomes available, but at the foundation, you still have to understand how these concepts build on each other to know why something may be better or worse in certain ways than the other. And the way that you get that is by starting out at the basics, right? IT and networking, right? Like I said, networking administrators. If I asked anyone by show of hands if they know what the OSI model is right now for networking, who would be able to raise their hands? So this is a computer science class, and I see 6 hands. Well, I can raise my hand too, but maybe 7 people who can put their hands up. Who here relies on a packet going from their device to another device like magic and doesn't know how that takes place? Right? And that's essential. That is the foundational model of how the entire internet and a lot of our technology works, right? That is wild to think about. That most people, it's more or less magic, right? And so you have to start out in a role, and you have to understand, what does the physical layer look like? What does a local network or a local link look like? How do we work up into things like routing between different autonomous systems that work between, whether it's a carrier like Rogers or Bell or Telus versus our own internal networks? How do those get built? How do they communicate with each other? That previously used to be something that was a foundational concept of IT security, because people found it similar to physical barriers, right? You could use a network like the way you would use a wall or a door or a castle moat to be able to protect yourselves. That's changing now just because of different operational requirements. Who here attended school during COVID? So probably most can, right? Back in the day, a school could defend themselves just by putting up a nice little wall around the school's network and calling it a day, right? But when people have to come in from the outside for things like remote work or remote schooling, that changes the threat paradigm. That changes the sorts of protective measures that we can take to protect against that, right? That's an example of why you'd start out in a role like a network administrator or a network admin. How about a systems administrator? Who here's built a computer before? Show of hands. basic hardware knowledge, probably had to install an operating system, maybe a little configuration about user accounts on that. How hard was it? First time, think about it. Yeah, had some good content you could use off the internet to be able to help figure it out. Imagine doing that for 15,000 devices in an organization and trying to manage that back and forth, right? Imagine trying to keep 15,000 devices up to date, right? From a patching perspective, how do you approach that, right? These are critical things that are required for security that are just foundational building blocks. And so that's why a lot of individuals will start as a software developer, or a network admin, or a system admin, and then they'll gradually work into a security focused role as they get a better understanding of those foundational technologies and how they work back and forth with each other and what the risks are associated with them and how they can compensate against those. And then you get into things like more general jobs. So like I said, a vulnerability tester, right? How can I test code that I'm writing to make sure that it is performative and that it doesn't have security compromises? How can I analyze specific traffic, whether it's network or device-based, to make sure that it's performing as intended and nothing bad is taking place on these devices, right? From an auditing perspective, how can I make sure everybody else is doing their jobs, right? Any questions about that around the general feeder roles and the availability of different jobs that exist within the cybersecurity world? And I can never cover them all in one presentation, but I'm trying to open your minds about how broad of a field it is and how many opportunities are available with it.
I feel like if you're like a junior developer or somebody working as a sysadmin or whatnot, I feel like there's a lot of paths that kind of career could take you. What kind of resources would one need to maybe move towards that other state of cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would say is, one, cybersecurity might not be the path that you want to take. I'll always start with that, right? If you have other motivations or interests because you're more drawn to something like AI or you're more drawn to somewhere else, I always like to motivate people to go towards what they're most interested in because it's probably what you're going to be the best at. But if you do want to go down the security pathway, right, you're going to start looking at things like a lot of testing procedures. How do we perform DAST, dynamic application security testing, to make sure that the code is not bringing in dependencies that shouldn't exist there, to make sure that there aren't basic level missing semicolons or bounds ranges that are going to be exploited. Then we're going to start moving beyond that into things like dynamic application security testing, right? Let's deploy it to a test server and let's do some fuzzing to try and put some input values in giant generative lists to see if it behaves and it's fine and can handle errors or exceptions, right? Anyone ever heard of sanitizing input values before? That's good. That's good. That's a lot of hands. That's better than the last time I asked that question here. Who feels comfortable talking about why you're supposed to sanitize input values?
Of like SQL injection can happen, you can return database values which are not supposed to be seen by the user.
Yep, exactly. So computers are just computers, right? They take input, they spit it back out. At the end of the day, it's all just zeros and ones. And it's almost, if you ever look at any computer systems engineers or like low-level hardware kind of like kernel folks in the room. Okay. Anyone ever heard of the concept of a von Neumann architecture? No? Okay, we got a couple. All right, it's fine. Basically, not a lot of operations that a computer can perform, right? From a 0 or 1 perspective. We have to build everything on top of those zeros and ones, right? That's where the kernel comes in and starts to restrict things like who can perform which actions, right? And so as we're building on top of those things, those are kind of arbitrary constraints that we put in. But when you have something like a web application, if you're not putting the proper precautionary methods in, like sanitizing your input values, right? What is the difference between me sending a SQL data request to a database and getting a table back versus me putting that into a form in a web content and it going directly to the database, right? If there's no sanitization of the input values, it's going to spit it right back out. And that can't happen when you're dealing with things like public health records or bank account information, right? And so that's kind of what you're starting to build on when you're looking at DAST analysis, is things like cross-site scripting, SQL injections. If you're interested from a security perspective around that, there's OWASP Top 10, if you've ever heard of it before. It's kind of like the 10 most standard compromises that you're going to see with web applications or applications in general, and learning how all of those function and how to work against those. You make a career out of that by yourself. Any other questions?
So if you're looking to go towards the security route, like if you're going into a career and looking to steer that direction a little bit, is there a way you should be selecting which feeder roles you're looking at? Like what opportunities will get you further in that direction, right?
Question, because it cues me up on my next slide. So, 2 slides, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. What I will say is a constant, and I try and talk about these constants for anyone in the cybersecurity world, is what makes a person successful in a cybersecurity role? So a constant desire or effort to learn new things. Things are constantly changing. I was a poli-sci student, joined in, was more than happy to learn things. I had comp sci graduates I worked with that learned on punch cards back in the 60s, and they never learned anything after that, right? And so if you're not willing to keep up with the rate of change, you're going to find yourselves in a deeply uncomfortable circumstance of a constantly changing world. A deep comprehension of how things work, right? Don't just take things for granted just because it works, right? Don't just take the input that comes from the LLM. Understand why something's functioning the way it does, right? Get down to the root, right? There's times where I've seen things like point of sale terminals failing because of specific things. And I can literally think from a logical perspective down in the code, probably what's taking place or the error that's been written into the code that's causing that issue, right? That's the kind of level of brevity that you want to get into. A lot of the stuff that we do these days is heavily abstracted, and that makes it more accessible to the general public. But if you want to work in security, you got to be able to get beyond that level of abstraction to understand what's underneath it. What are the more difficult things, right? And if people aren't comfortable or familiar with the concept of abstraction, think about any car you get in has the same steering wheel and the same pedals. Standard and automatic can be a little different, but not much, mostly similar, right? Even though they might be using different engine systems between electric or gas or petrol, diesel, right? That's an abstraction, right? That makes something that can be different under the hood, easily accessible to people beyond that. Try and be able to learn the things that exist underneath that, because it's going to allow you to understand why things are behaving the way that they are. And it's going to provide you more context on how you can defend it or exploit it. Third one is a very hard one for a lot of people to do. The ability to communicate complex topics in security, especially around risks, to people in a way that makes sense to them. Oftentimes, as a security practitioner or anyone working in the cybersecurity world, people are not going to understand how that stuff works, and they're going to be coming to you for advice or guidance on what to do. And you have to be able to, through analogies or through comparisons, explain that to them in a way where they can make an informed decision about what needs to be done. And that's not an easy thing to do, right? But I highly implore you to go out and try and explain. As you learn complex things, try and be able to explain them to another person. Try and be able to walk through why something exists the way it does. The ability to maintain calm under stressful circumstances. If you're working in cybersecurity, you're probably going to get some calls in the middle of the night or at a bad time. I've seen Fortune 500 executives puke into buckets, unfortunately, right? If you're working in cybersecurity, you're that trusted professional. You have to be able to maintain your calm, maintain your dignity under those circumstances, because people are going to be increasing guidance, and they need you to be comfortable with that. This is a good one, not just in cybersecurity, but anything in life. Admit what you don't know. I had to learn this lesson the hard way a couple of times when I started working out in the federal government, and to this day, I still respect Jordan LeBlanc for it. A couple of times I went into a meeting and he said, "Hey, do you know what this is?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, I know what that is." He went, "Okay, explain it to me." I went, "I don't know what it is." And he said, "Why did you say you knew it then?" "Well, I didn't want to be judged for it." He's like, "Well, now you really look like an idiot, don't you?" Right? Got me twice. And since then, forevermore. If I don't know something, I just say I don't know it. I'm willing to learn it, but I just don't know, right? And that goes hand in hand with the last portion. Well, mostly the last portion. When people don't know things, if you have a network that you can call on of other people who are knowledgeable in different areas or more knowledgeable than you, you're going to go a lot further being able to solve those problems. And so it takes a community to be able to solve a lot of these issues. I will never claim that I'm an expert in all fields of cybersecurity. I have some things I'm better at than my colleagues. Lots of things my colleagues are going to be way better than me at those things. But I can always call and I can rely on. And that goes hand in hand with the last portion, which is you want to make work fun. People who are successful in the field, and this isn't exclusive to cybersecurity, but are people you want to work with, right? It's really hard to be able to capture a combination of one, being good at your job, being competent, and being the person people want to go to because they want to work with you, right? But if you can do both of those things, you're gonna be in pretty good demand. And now this gets into the question, right? Which is, you know what, we're getting there. A little further than I thought. How to develop these skills. These are photos of my lab environment that I have at home. So I got a 12, like I was saying earlier, 12U server rack that I have. You don't have to have a 12U server rack at home to be able to test things, but you can play around, build, learn how a switch works, learn how to install basic components on a computer, understand how to interact with those back and forth. If you want to be, like I said, one of those people from that previous slide, go out and interact with other people from the community. Get perspectives that you don't already have, right? It doesn't even have to be the tech industry. You might be surprised by what some of your colleagues or friends in different areas are going to be able to teach you or inform you on. You want to be good with technology? You got to work with technology. Build a home lab, have fun, spin up some virtual machines, play with the cloud, learn how networking works, write some programs. The more you go out and play around with things, the more informed you're going to be successful in your job. Don't just feel constrained to what your immediate job is or your schooling is around, right? You can go and I'm learning CNC milling right now, or I'm, being able to run a lathe to be able to create watch parts, right? Probably never going to be practical for what I have to do in my job, but if I ever had to print a PCB, I know what goes into that. And develop a feedback loop of credible sources that make learning fun, right? I'm a millennial, I'm sorry. I'm not a boomer, I'm a millennial. But I have specific things that I'll frequently watch or have integrated into my life, mostly through YouTube, as I'll provide an example here, of places I'll go or constantly keep up with to learn about new things. Core Dumped, awesome, getting into good, well-written explanations about how core systems and engineering principles work within systems. Low-level learning. He's a reverse engineering. He'll teach you basically, you can go and watch and learn how to decompile a binary, right? And be able to reverse engineer something back from malware, right? Fireship, a lot of meme content, just interesting. What's going on in the world in a period of time. Jeff Earling, when I talk about building a home lab, whether it's cluster computing, whether it's parallel processing, Lawrence Systems, learn how to do networking. Lewis Rossman, a lot of expletives, a lot of swearing. He gets really mad about hardware laws in the States and things like right to repair. But it's interesting and important to know about different ways that tech interacts with society. Primogen, another one of those more meme content delivery software developers. He was a senior engineer for Netflix for 10 years, so he has some interesting perspectives and hot takes on the state of the industry. And then I'm a Microsoft guy, so obviously I have to have another bald guy in there from Microsoft, and that's John Saville. He basically puts out content. He's one of our chief technical fellows, and he's constantly putting out content about how different technology works in the Microsoft world, which is important for folks like me to be able to keep up with everything that's happening. But now we get to the question about where do you start to cybersecurity? Cybersecurity careers, like I said, aren't often going to start in cybersecurity. If you can get any cyber job, doesn't have to be security, could be development, could be an IT admin, could be network engineering. If you can get anything, that's going to be better than nothing. And you're going to be able to use that to build, to be able to work into other positions where you want to be. You might actually find out that you like things that you never thought you were going to like before, and it might change the trajectory for you. Unfortunately, the vast majority of roles that exist within the world will never go up into a job posting that you can apply for. And so it's very important that you're out and interacting with people, because they will be the first to tell you if they're looking to hire somebody. They might even just skip the whole process and bring you entirely in. The only job I ever applied to in a public forum that I got was that first FSWEP job I was talking about. After that, every single job I've got that I've moved around at was always through word of mouth or somebody else vouching for me. You are students. You are super fortunate that you have lots of mechanisms that are exclusively for you, whether it's co-op, whether it's postgraduate programs, whether it's just jobs that you're allowed to take while you're a student. Find companies that you like, see if they have specific carve-outs for students, and apply to those things. I've got SWEP here. That's how I got into the trade. Communication Security Establishment. They are the Canadian federal government's equivalent to the NSA. They are the cybersecurity spies that we have. Most people don't even know that they exist. They're out in the East End. They are constantly trying to find students and new talent to enter the organization. Only caveat there is there's about a 1-year waiting process to get cleared from a security process, which makes it difficult. But if you can get through that, you get hired on there, you basically want to work at any other company from a security perspective, you're gonna be going straight to the top of the list. CrowdStrike, another one of our competitors, very well recognized within the security industry, Palo Alto, Cisco, other major security and networking vendors that are well known. We've all got prioritized programs that exist for students. Leverage those while you can, because they will not exist forever. And so if you can get into those and you can get experience, more often than not, you're probably going to be able to ride that the rest of the way through your professional career. And it's going to be a lot easier to do that while you're in a constrained pool of people who are able to apply than everybody else. And so now I get to do the Microsoft portion. Now we have an early in profession career opportunities, mostly geared towards a combination of graduates, so recent graduates, co-op students, assignments, and we call these our early in profession opportunities. Microsoft, our credo is to empower every person in every organization on the planet to achieve more. That's kind of our guiding station that we're working towards. A lot of the things I talked about today is in kind of conjunction with how we operate internally as a business. You're going to see a lot of the same propaganda out of any of the other organizations that are going to exist. But idea of constant learning, focusing on your customers, trying to be inclusive, and then working together as a team. In Canada, we have over 5,500 employees across all different regions and offices. We've been 100% remote for the vast majority of our folks, even before COVID existed. I can work entirely from home if I want. I can go into an office tomorrow in Ottawa. I can go into the Toronto office, the Vancouver office, the Montreal office, the London office, the Frankfurt office. Lots of flexibility to go around to different places. We interact extensively with lots of other areas in the community. We've got lots of different hosting regions that exist here, and we got lots of different opportunities. Internship programs primarily focus on anybody who's undergraduate. There are specific programs we also have for people in more advanced stages, so MBAs, PhDs, JDs, so if you're kind of a lawyer. We have specific streams for those, but oftentimes, and we just posted some of the jobs actually this week for the upcoming cohort, and they'll always be tagged hashtag EIP, which is the only reason I'm putting that in the presentation. We're constantly bringing in, specifically along times of the year, about those sorts of things. Like I said, not all jobs have to be exclusively tech. We got things like HR rotations, finance, cloud supply and chain rotation. We're open to hiring lots of various different people, different backgrounds. Like I said, whether you're coming from school, whether you're a veteran, so on and so forth. The big roles, oftentimes, like I said, these are going to be feeder roles, right? We're not going to be hiring advanced level positions for most students. That kind of starts somewhere else, right? So we have things like marketing, human resources, finance. Most of the folks here would probably be interested in things like customer success and sales, which is where I live. And that's going to be around things like field-facing security resources or technical resources, specialists who are helping sell things, or software developers. So those engineering and product roles, not just software engineers, right? We got hardware engineers too, if there's any electrical engineering folks that exist in here, or any mechanical engineering folks that exist in here. Program and product managers, right? Who are the people who work together to make sure the teams are pushing in the right direction, prioritizing the right things that you want added to the product or the functionality, and making sure that's all going together. And so that's what I said about, we got things like the development side where we have program managers and software engineers. The data scientist roles right now are exclusive to masters and PhDs. Unfortunately, just the level of interest that exists there is rather intensive. And like I said, from the hardware side, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, comp sci graduates, everything in between. Internships typically take place between 3 to 4 months. Co-ops typically 8 months, and we run them every fall, winter, and summer. Those exist at careers.microsoft.com. But I want to open things up generally for any other questions or concerns. I know we're coming right in on time at 7 o'clock on the dot right now, but I want to leave more than happy to stick around for the next little while to take any questions or concerns.
Why Ottawa?
Why did I end up in Ottawa?
No, you said there's a lot of flexibility and that you're the only person that does security in the cloud in Ottawa.
Just natural population distribution, I guess. We previously had some other people here that they've gone off out of roles or jobs. But most people are going to be where the most people are, right? So you're going to be looking at Toronto, GTA area, you're going to be looking at Montreal, you're going to be looking at Vancouver, generally speaking.
I meant you.
Well, why am I in Ottawa? Oh, I mean, well, I came to school here, I came to Carleton, I couldn't leave this. But no, I will say is I travel extensively for work quite frequently, so like I just got a request. 2 hours ago that I'm gonna have to be in Vancouver at the end of the month, I'm gonna have to be in Toronto at the end of the month as well. I've had to travel as far as Germany before to be able to do work. I like Ottawa, it's a livable city, it's a safe city, it's filled with very smart people. I got no other complaints.
Would you recommend people to pursue a post undergraduate degree?
So I have hot takes on this because when I finished my undergraduate, and I only did a 3-year undergraduate. On the BA side, you can just do a 3-year instead of a full honors program. I just wanted to be done with it, right? Because I was doing a degree that wasn't practical for the thing that I was doing for work at the time. And I said I would never take a master's degree. Yeah, I said I would never take a master's degree. And that changed over time, right? And I really appreciate that I took the time after school to go out and work in the workforce and to learn how things worked out from a practical side so that I could bring that back as part of my experience on the master's side. And so Carleton, I was like a B average student, kind of gradually. When I did my master's, I was an A+ student because I was seriously interested in the topic and I had good background or context to be able to provide to the program that I was doing that work. So I will say there's always value in education, but timing and circumstance is important, right? So it's going to depend on what specifically you want to do. Like I said, data and AI right now, going to be looking for more advanced degrees that are going to take place there. You want to be a lawyer for Microsoft, you're going to have to get a law degree. That's just how it's there's no degrees there. But I'm also for, and I will say the vast majority of my colleagues on my team actually don't have university degrees. That might come as a shock, but it's going to be individually led. And I'm happy that I did my master's. I was very happy with the experiences I had and I did it, but it's going to depend where you're at in your life and what your priorities are at the time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I know that's another it depends answer, right? And that's kind of the crux of what most of these things exist, but that's my opinion.
So you were mentioning during the presentation that cybersecurity is not really somewhere you start, it's more somewhere you end up.
Yep.
So back home for me, which is Brockville, St. Lawrence College is offering like a 1 to 2 year cybersecurity, like I guess certificate or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on something like that.
Yeah, I will say, and my parents live in Rockville, my sister lives in Rockville, so like I said, I spent time in Cardiff, up the way on St. Lawrence. But I will say is there is a difficult disconnect that exists between the high-level practical generalized knowledge within a university and the hands-on technical knowledge that you get within a college program. I think BITS is a really cool example of a program that's been able to bridge that gap to provide the university level theory along with the practical hands-on considerations. It's helpful, but if you can get a job and you can get a hands-on experience too, I think that's just as arguably more valuable if you can. But barring that, and you still want to work on those skills, still value exists there as well. Okay. I like to be hands-on with things. I like to be working with it in a practical environment. As you see, was more than happy to work with my own lab test environments, but nothing really beats being in a real world scenario, working with real customers, surrounded by people who have been doing these sorts of things for years to be able to learn that we can.
Would you say you received a lot of mentorship from people during your career journey? And do you have specific suggestions for how students can find mentors and during their time here as well?
I was so fortunate. I will always sing the praises of my colleagues like Kevin Black. I had colleagues like Greg Locke. I had colleagues like Keith. What was his last name? Austin? Keith Austin. I think it was Austin. Jean-Francois Richer. These were people who really took the time to help show me how things work, like how to set up a web server or how to do a forensic capture of an image of a device and then go ripping through the registry values associated with it. And I was lucky that I just fell into those roles. And while I was working with them, I was surrounded by really good people that I got along with that were willing to step into those. I wish we had better offerings of programs for that mentorship. Willing to help out where I can. Obviously, I can't bring you on the job and walk you through some of the stuff that I do because the privacy concerns associated with that. More than happy to talk to people about questions they have around specific things in the tech industry or anything like that. But you're going to want to try and find people you get along well with within a job. And you're going to try and you'll figure out who knows what they're doing and who doesn't know what they're doing. and what you can operate based off of that. And so to me, it's kind of, it goes back to that networking concept and that building allies around you is unfortunately time and circumstance is a big limitation for that.
Would you say that most cybersecurity roles or security roles in general, I guess, involve like on-site stuff and of certain proximity? And would you say that it's spending one way or the other, I guess?
In the past, I would say that was the case. Currently, I wouldn't. I really wouldn't. Now, I will say that most businesses, especially after COVID, are gonna have some sort of remote solution. Unless you're working in SCIP, secure compartmentalized information kind of area, in say like a secret or a top secret facility, you're probably gonna have remote options that are available. Now, some businesses, because of arbitrary reasons or politics, are going to force people back into the office. That's just inevitable. But I would say in the security industry, like even right now, the vast majority, unless there is an on-site compromise in an area that's like air gap and doesn't have network access, I can do remote. No problem.
With your role at Microsoft, what's your thoughts on Windows recall?
So recall's an interesting one, right? And that's, so I'd be curious out of the group, who here has heard of a recall? Show of hands. Okay, so what are the things that can go wrong with recall?
Your personal data gets sent over the cloud.
What sort of personal data?
Well, I heard that it screenshots your whole screen, right?
Yeah.
So if you have something sensitive on your screen, that could be sent over the air, and I don't know what Microsoft has done to, secure that, but it could be.
Sent over the air, could be just captured on that local device and
Yeah.
somebody gets access to that device that can be compromised, right? What are other concerns you could have around recall?
Just the basic privacy concern.
Yep, absolutely. What about, let's talk about the ethical considerations around opt-in versus opt-out. Right? Is that, if there are concerns around that, why would that be a service that, and this is when you start thinking like a security engineer, right? Or an offensive security person, right? Is what can go wrong with these products and what can we do to be able to prevent that, right? And so, I'm kind of talking around it, but yes, there should be preventative measures that exist in place to be able to mitigate the concerns associated with that, and all of those concerns are 100% justified. So that's mine from a security practitioner's perspective. It's kind of the Texas two-step issue, but yeah, no, there are genuine concerns with it, and there are better compensating measures that should be in place to be able to prevent those concerns from taking place.
Did you actually provide any input to any teams about Windows recall, like the
So
implementation?
you have to remember, Microsoft is a big beast,
Yes.
right? We're talking 200,000 people worldwide, right? The vast majority of them in Redmond, Seattle, Washington on the West Coast. I don't get input for every product group, I wish, right? I got one product group this week, I was pretty good. That's not common. I would not say I bat one product group every week. I've been able to submit stuff to like the Windows, not directly contribute, but be able to provide the changes required for things to like the Windows kernel and the actual Windows operating system. But oftentimes the field resources are limited with our own engineering teams because they've got their own jobs they've got to do, right? And so a little frustrating. I completely agree with you on that. Oh, which please just not, there are ways we can be able to better this, right? So anytime you work in a large organization, you're gonna find the left hand isn't always in synchronization with the right hand. So
Project wise, on like a resume, would you find, or what do you think would give someone an edge up on like the resume pile?
So this lets me have a bigger discussion about general things in the world. Who here is currently specializing in AI or machine language? Only two hands? That's it. What are the other specializations in here? Cybersecurity, okay, anybody else? Or just general programs?
Backend?
Backend, okay, all right. Anybody else? No other specializations, just generic, open black. See, that surprises me. I would have expected a lot more hands for AI or ML. The only thing better than being the best in your industry is being the only person in your industry. And so I oftentimes try and steer towards technologies that other people don't know or aren't as comfortable with. There are benefits with that and there are downsides with that. Right? Generalists will be able to do lots of little things and typically be fairly well compensated for those. Specialists will be extremely well compensated or coveted, but you don't have the same sort of flexibility to do other jobs or other roles that you might have if you're being a generalist. So My preference is to specialize in things that other people don't know. So examples being like Kubernetes, low-level implementation of the kernel operating system, advanced malware analysis techniques, those sorts of things that aren't super common skills, just because they provide me a little more leverage. And so if I was to say, one, find something you like. Two, I hope it's something that a lot of other people like, right? And so if you can specialize in things that other people don't know, that's going to make you competitive. And oftentimes people talk about, this is part of that larger discussion. If you ever look at a graph of like programs in Stanford, about which programs they're going into, and everyone know what Stanford is here, you know, West Coast, well recognized computer science program. People talk about AI taking entry-level positions for things like computer science. If you look at a chart of the programs in Stanford and you see a giant rocket of a single program going up, outpacing all the other programs, which program do you think that is? It's computer science, right? In the 2010s, we had a big lack of people that existed within the computer science world. And so, like I said, you're 15, you hear a bunch of people talking about a shortage of people in the computer science world. Your parents hear a bunch of people talking about a shortage in the computer science world, and everybody rushes in. And then everybody's fighting for the same limited positions, right? And so if you can differentiate yourself or try and focus on areas that other people aren't, that oftentimes is going to give you a leg up. Any other questions? And I will be sticking around for a while after if you want something more individual.
I wanted to know your take on like certifications like Security Plus or like CCNA.
It's a good way to demonstrate knowledge. So when I was consulting, a lot of times for hiring, it'll be a requirement on a grid. So like I have my CISP is kind of like the security requirement. You can't just start and get that. You have to have 5 years of experience, like a guild system, like back in medieval eras, or somebody has to verify you that already has the certification. They'll help you get into the job. And oftentimes that's something that they're going to be looking for, especially if you ever want to get into like a consulting world. There will be grids for marking and bid processes about who gets to win those things. And oftentimes that will be based off of certain certifications or thresholds. So they're valuable, they exist there. Try and strike a balance between practical certifications that are going to teach you new things or allow you to expand on your knowledge. Also understand that a lot of certifications require a recertification, and there's costs associated with that and time associated with that, right? One of the reasons I like my CISSP is because it's a 3-year interval. And if I do other training or other things, those credits count for my recertification rather than say, like when I had a Google cert for a Google Certified Professional Cloud Architect, where I would have to go back and rewrite that every 2 years. And that doesn't seem like an onerous task for a single certification. But if you're holding 10 or 20 certifications, having to rewrite 10 or 20 certifications every year or two can be quite long and costly. Are you thinking about Security Plus?
No, I was just thinking about it.
Yeah, hey man, it's a good, well-recognized cert in the industry.
On the topic of Security Plus, I'm using the Google certificate, the Google Cybersecurity one on Coursera you spoke about earlier as like a hop to that. Is it worth putting, let's say, both of them on the resume? Because one demonstrates practical knowledge versus Security Plus is all theory.
Yeah, but if you completed the criteria and the requirements for both of them, I put them both on. Yeah, absolutely. I actually, before they released the cybersecurity one, that was back in the days I started out with their IT support professional. It's actually kind of where I started my technical learning journey. So, and I found the content to be very good. Any other questions?
Do you own a Windows computer?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. So I have a Windows computer that's issued to me by Microsoft that is a Surface that I sometimes use. Absolutely. And then I, of course, have a gaming computer in that giant server rig that I've got running. And then also run Windows as well. Also, anyone familiar with the concept of virtualization or hypervisors in the room? Yeah, I'm seeing lots of hands go up. I got hundreds of Windows VMs running. So yeah. I have some physical VMs. I have some physical Windows machines. I have lots of virtual Windows machines. And as you can probably imagine, expected to have a pretty good knowledge of Windows working for Microsoft. But good question.
Follow up to that. Are you sticking on Windows 10 or are you going to Windows 11?
Oh, I was on the private alpha of Windows 11 and literally lost my entire GUI interface I had to completely reinstantiate it through making some, doing some PowerShell operating. Yeah, so I've been on since the very beginning. We internally, the terminology we use, and you won't see it here, but you'll see sometimes when a Microsoft person's operating internally, you'll have a little DF associated with your build number. Anyone want to guess what DF stands for? Dog food. So the principle that we use is you have to eat your own dog food, right? And so if you actually look at the way that we do deployment methodologies for software, the way that it works out is you can opt into a ring methodology of like a private, like public beta that exists. Before the public beta, there's 2 internal channels that got released internally at Microsoft that we have to test through first before those go out to the general public. So needless to say, sometimes a little disruption to my workflow. Good question. Any other?
What happened to Windows 9?
What's the question? I wish I had the answer for you. If I ever get that one, I'd love to put it out into the public, but no idea.
This could be a total rumor, but I heard that it had something to do with compatibility checkers for Windows 95 and 98. Basically took the string and it checked if there was a 9 in the operating system number. So if they called it Windows 9, it broke those compatibility tools.
That is such a practical, reasonable, grounded thing that it totally makes sense. And that's what I said about understanding like the bare components of why something exists, right? I've had customers before ask questions about things that aren't working, right? Like, why can't I save this name, right? I'm like, how many characters is that name? 37? Nah, not gonna work. But why? He said, well, we only support 32 characters. Why? Well, when the developer wrote it back in the early 2000s, they thought they would never need more than 32 characters. So that's just the way it is, right? And so that is a super practical way of looking at something, understanding what the system was built before, and then being able to extrapolate and stuff with that. So yeah, I believe it. Makes sense.
I wanted to ask, like, what are some things you did earlier in your career to like, understanding that you cybersecurity is very broad and like changes over time. What are some things you've done to like keep up to date and like really grow with the?
So you ever heard the term RTFM? Okay, so I'm gonna slightly change what other people refer to it as. Let's say read the manual. The documentation, oftentimes you'll spend a lot of time reading documentation. To understand how something works, right? Like a test environment. And like I said, you do a certain sort of, not a literal boundary checking with memory allocation, but like, how far can I push this, right? How can I break it? How can I provide practical applications of it? Like I said, practical lab environment, playing around hands-on with the technology, reading the documentation, talking to other people that work with it, right? Especially if they know more than us, right? Super fortunate to work in an environment where I have people who specialize in specific technologies. And so being able to say, hey, Francis, I know you're a specialist at the implementation of this one specific containerized system. Can you explain to me how this works, right? And he might give me an entire day's worth of reading documentation in literally 20 minutes, right? So preference to lean on people where possible, documentation and playing around with it yourselves. And that's mostly just through the school of hard knocks, how I got a lot of the knowledge.
Oh, yeah, all right. So I know everyone's probably pretty hungry, and I know that you probably have a lot of questions. But let's just give a really big round of applause to our